Okay, wow, thank you. Thank you so much. I could ask you a lot, I could keep talking to you all day, to be honest, but we do have to move on to the Q&A. I do particularly love what you have spoken about with regards to politics and its role when it comes to liberation. I think that's a really interesting point that you've raised there. And we really do appreciate your thoughts on the life and the ideas of Dereck Walcott. It was really enjoyable to hear a bit more about one of our more artistic pantheons, so that was great. So now it's time for you to meet our audience and to get their thoughts and questions on the life and work of Dereck Walcott. I've seen a lot of activity in the chat, so I'm assuming that people have a lot of questions for you.
Or questions for each other.
Maybe, we'll see. But we have, I think, just under an hour or so, might not go on for that long. And as I said at the beginning, we will take questions in rounds of 2 or 3 until we close. So if you do have a question, I just want you to raise your virtual hand. And then when asked, you can then come onto camera, come off mute, and talk to Vladimir directly. I will also be monitoring the chat. And so if you feel more comfortable drafting your question there so that I can ask on your behalf, then please do so, and I'll blend them into the segment just to keep us flowing. So if we make a start, who would like to ask the first question? If you raise, if you use the functionality to raise your virtual hand, then I can call for you to come off mute. So I'll have a look in the chat as well. Doesn't seem like anyone has their hands up at the moment. So, okay, we've got a question from Eric. Do you want to come off mute and ask Vladimir your question? Eric, if you'd like to come off mute.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
I just wondered whether you could tell us a little bit more about this tension between truth and myth. And I don't know whether he was suggesting that Walcott said that truth truth was killed or truth died. So I was wondering, that seems to suggest that truth at some stage existed and what brought about its demise. And then what is it about myth which makes it appropriate to be an alternative or a replacement for truth? What is the purpose of myth?
Okay. All right. The quote from about truth being crucified and destroyed was actually from Sun Ra, jazz musician, but I was saying that Sun Ra was what got me to look at Walcott's essay and its discussion of issues like that anew. In respect to the difference between the two, if I think I have your question correctly, it has to do with the structure. I mean, even our understanding of truth is as it is linked to, let's say, reality, right? Has been determined by a certain kind of poetics, a certain idea of how truth is produced. And within the context of history, there is a certain understanding of the relationship between the past and the present, a certain understanding of cause and effect that is still very epistemically particular, still very much provincial, still very much the emanating from one way of viewing the world. And that is the way of the people who have dominated the idea of writing history in a particular way, according to a particular kind of movement. I mean, I would evoke Kamau Brathwaite here, for example, who, you know, within a lot of the philosophy of history, we have the reference of dialectic as part of its engines moving forward. And Kamau Brathwaite spoke about dialectics. He's talking about something else that is not seeking the resolution of dialectics, but is moving out and coming back in as the tide. And that itself constitutes, it's his own creation. If you hear it, it's dialectics, you know, but it's him creating or finding a shape for another philosophy of history, another shape of history that gives birth to a different kind of truth, or if you want to call it, a different relationship between ourselves and history, a different relationship between ourselves and truth. So myth, for one, offers Walcott the idea of time as recursive, not time as progressive, teleological, or chronological. Part of the truth we understand about reality has to do with the chronology of history. has to do with the teleology of it, the summing up of these events, this caused that, so we see that as true, right? And we see that as the truth, perhaps, of this or that. Walcott sees in myth the idea of a recursivity, which creates a relationship, which is useful to him, obviously, between the past and the present, that is one of mutuality, one of kind of symbiosis, if you want to call it, a need of the past, the past needing the present and the present needing the past, or the two working together as a way of extending both. So I'm saying myth is more useful to Walcott. The structure of myth is more useful to him, and there is a useful and a generative cynicism about the idea of truth and its kind of authoritative status, and even its universal status, when there is this sense of our idea of it being so very influenced by a particular, not just history, but a particular historiography that produces truth, so to speak. I'm trying not to get overly academic about it, but that's essentially what it does. The shape of it allows a certain equality between younger civilizations and older civilizations. For example, the authority claimed by older civilizations and the kind of inferiority that is that younger civilizations are relegated to. In myth, in recursive time, that is not so. In myth, in recursive time, the two are contemporaries because they're simultaneous concepts.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna just have a look in the chat. I know there's a lot of comments here that maybe you can respond to or give your thoughts on. And like I said, anyone else that does want to ask a question, if you just raise your hand, then I will come to you as soon as possible. Okay, go to a question first before I go to the chat. Got one from Goodness. Goodness, do you want to come off mute, please?
In actual fact, it's not a question as such, but I just wanted to find out if Vladimir can agree with me in this one, because to me, when he was talking about the myth and the truth, or the truth having died with Christ being crucified, in my mind, it came, I was reminded of James Cone in his writing of Black Power, where he was saying that when you believed at the time, you were believing in a foreign God, the God that never existed. When he said, God is black. In other words, it's like saying, it's a myth to say there's a God for us as Black people if we take a foreign God that is presented to us by the oppressor. I don't know, that's what came into my mind. I don't know if I was right, but that's what I thought of, because he says God is Black because of that. Now I was just thinking that could it be the same thing, that maybe he was referring to myth in that sense, and the truth having died in that sense, that we were presented by the God of the oppressor, the white God, that actually never existed, because there is no God that could reject what he had created in Black race. Thank you.
Okay. I think, if I'm understanding correctly, and I think I do, I'm thinking, because it's addressing something similar to what the last person asked. I think the idea is, and that quote again is from Sun Ra, but I think it's useful. It's something I agree with in a way as well. It's not a matter of, what he's recounting, but what he's saying is, there's the idea of something authoritative that is, how to put it, it's either its way or the highway. The idea of truth is that it is truth, and everything else, the treatment of the lie or the treatment of the opposite of truth, is its rejection, its nullification, so that there is the truth and everything else is nullified in a sense, right? That is the poetics of truth. That is how truth operates. The idea of myth is something that's acknowledging creative potential and relation as the reality of the world, relativity as the reality of the world as well. Or at least it allows for that, in that the idea of truth and the poetics of truth as intolerant in a sense, so to speak, if you want to think about it that way, especially as it was used, right? In Sunra's example, he's talking about the Christian use of this God and everybody else's thing is nullified. Everybody else's thing is somehow less. That approach, that poetics of exclusion, that poetics, which is very much there in colonialism in a sense, where it is this way and everything else is relegated to something else. Myth provides an alternative to that, because myth is crucifying the whole structure of truth, which allows for something like James Cone or whoever saying God is black to have the same status as another claim, like God is white or God is Asian or God is whatever. It opens up the possibility for a world that is governed by relation, not a world that's governed by exclusion or that equation of is and is not, with a certain treatment and a certain understanding of the status of is not, which is a certain structure that oppressed us ourselves. You know, the colonizers were human and we were among other things, you know, nature, we were part of nature, part of the plants, part of the animals. We were kind of relegated in that. That is the same structure in a sense that truth had been made to follow. Truth as a cultural production. Truth as a cultural production, and truth which was given a certain status in our epistemology by a particular culture that it was serving. Right? That is where myth comes to combat it in that way, because it didn't, the structure of how we understand truth is not something that's coming out and nobody, it's just this objective fact. It's also in our lived reality, it has been the same shape as the very things we faced in our confrontation with European expansionism and colonialism. So why are there these similar shapes? So at least as far as we have experienced it, truth has come with that idea of apartheid, that idea of this is worth it, this is, and this is not. I'll stop there with that.
Thank you.
Thank you. So we've got a question from Nigel. Do you want to come off mute, please?
Yes, I have a few questions actually.
Okay.
This idea of recursive myth, I'm wondering where Walcott got the idea from and if he read Joseph Campbell, because it's quite reminiscent of his work or my understanding of his work. But isn't this just a key tenet of African philosophy? And can't we find that in African philosophy? And given also what you said about identity and not being boxed in, does that position make the seeking of an African ontology, which is useful to Pan-Africanism, futile?
Okay. You might need to remind me of the last question. I think I remember it, but if I get there and I don't, I'll ask you just to repeat it.
No,
the idea of recursive time as a feature or component of that idea of myth is, I'm not sure whether Walcott read Campbell, but he was interested in myth both as myths in terms of the content of myths. I mean, albeit a lot of the myths that he knew very well would have come from European, classical European literature or whatever. But also one of his first plays was based on a Caribbean myth. And, you know, the understanding that these stories, at least especially in the African context, are not just that. They are representations of something else. It's representations of what Sunra may call cosmic equations, the way in which the universe organizes itself. And one of his first plays, Tija and His Brothers, exemplifies that. It's a story that I'm sure if I tell it, it's a Caribbean one, but I'm sure if I tell it, it's going to be recognizable anywhere there are Africans, because it's told in one version or another there, maybe with different names. That was like your first question. I don't know if you read Campbell, but I think he had access to it anyway, you know, and it does end up becoming as key. One of the points I'm making is Walcott's approach, albeit taking it through a different route that doesn't seem patently Black or African, brought him to the poetics of African spirituality, which is of course a part of African philosophy, which informs African philosophy, or which African philosophy informs, or both. But he got through it in his own route, which was a very unlikely route perhaps of going through Europe, his interest in myth, his local St. Lucian and Caribbean landscape and social scape and manscape. And he finds this structure very useful for him. But this structure is very redolent of the spiritual manifestations, which are not restricted to rituals and stuff like that. The spiritual manifestations, which manifest in the sensibility of the people. So lastly, I think your last question had to do with Pan-Africanism. You could just remind me?
The African ontology, is the search for that in Pan-Africanism futile?
I don't think it's futile, but in a way, if Pan-Africanism wants to survive as such, as in a kind of movement that has a very clearly drawn boundaries, or is kind of delimited in a very, it's dealing in definition a lot, African ontologies will create problems for that, because African ontologies are expansive, right? Whilst a lot of the others seem to be the opposite, in that there's this idea of the restriction of truth, one God. What African ontologies, as it manifests in African spirituality, is expansive, which is why Vodun, when it arrived in Haiti, was able to assimilate the idea of the mulatto. And you have Alois, who is a mulatto, right? Like Erzili is mulatto. You had it able to kind of assimilate, and very kind of, as most things African, is very resourceful, able to pull in what is this landscape and how do I adapt it. That's the source of the originality in African philosophy, is the ability to take anything and make it one's own, rather than to go back to some ancient origin point per se, because the realities are, there's no far origin point. The realities are side by side, parallel with each other. The past, if you want to call it the ancestors, are right there. You know what I mean? So African philosophy, African ontology ought to be, and is, and has been, as it's manifested, at least at the, let's call it the folk level, has been expansive. And that means it's also inclusive, but it includes in a way that it brings you in and adapts you to its style of doing things. So whether or not you're Black, mixed, one quarter or whatever, it's going to bring you into it, include you, and help you become a little African in the process as well. I think that's one of the strengths, I think, of African philosophy. So as for Pan-Africanism, it has to be prepared for a similar kind of spirituality, so to speak, where the boundaries are not drawn mostly according to things that are apparent, so to speak.
Yeah, well, I think that's quite problematic, because Pan-Africanism is trying to fix things, aren't we? We're trying to fix positions so we can have a basis for unity. So, and we're always seeking this basis for unity. And if it's expansive, as you call it, we're all going to be standing in different places and positions, right?
But what are we more concerned about? Are we concerned about the quality of lives of Black people, or that we're all aligned? The quality of lives of Black people includes their individual desires, which are the basic desires of a lot of human beings. The basic desires we want is our well-being, is to be able to eat, to be able to have money, to be able to be spiritually well. And any kind of definition, remember, definition is in some sense opposed to evolution. A definition is in many ways, if not careful, is opposed to evolution. And one of the things whether we want it or not, it is part of our birthright as human beings, is to evolve. And that includes going the wrong way, going the right way, going left, going right. So in a way, movements such as this, if they aren't willing to be expansive or to kind of adopt a different poetics other than that which other movements have taken, especially from other cultures, could potentially become stifling for the individual lives in that way, and for the evolution of these people and the quality of lives that they would like to lead, like everybody would like to lead, So I think if we have to trust our spirituality and the philosophy that they embody or encode, and we look at the poetics of these, maybe therein lies something that can assure us a certain kind of unity that need not be based so heavily on definition, the delimiting poetics of definition that usually becomes an obstacle to evolution. And we've seen that happen to us. We've seen it happen to us. Yeah, if we look on the continent, there are things where definition and those who fall outside of it, right? What happens? And in the Caribbean.
Thank you, brother.
Yeah.
Very important conversation there. Okay, so there's a couple of questions in the chat that I'll put them both to you together, and then you can answer the two of them.
Sure.
So we've got a question from, was it a question from Lorato? So could it be that Walcott could have seen the future where people don't want to be boxed in terms of origin, color, and gender? And then there is a second question from Celia, who has asked, to what extent do you think colorism/racism in the Caribbean and in the lived realities of Kamal and Dereck influence their views, even considering internalized racism and the etymology of the word Shabin, and also thinking of the work of Stuart Hall, experiencing oneself as an object from the outside, a serialized set of embarrassments?
Okay, I could see Celia's question. So the first one, could you just remind me of the first one again?
Yeah. So it was, could it be that Walcott has seen the future where people don't?
Okay, yes, I remember. I think people do want to be boxed in and not. You know, I'm thinking of something as temporary definitions. You know what I mean? Like, we do go through these phases. I don't know that people want, I mean, if you're not boxed into anything, then what? You know what I mean? It's like, I think there is a sense in which the box need not be permanent, and the box need not be a basis of identity. You know, a lot of things have come to stand in with this notion of identity that has become a big thing. That there is this sense of pronouncing I am that, right, as identity. But identity, if we're talking about identity as something, as an essence, as something within us, that as how we feel ourselves, the thing that defines that most is evolution, right? That's why I'm saying the identity, we're mixing things up a little bit in a way. My racial identity, my racial identity is a part of who I am. You know, it's the racial iteration of this me that's changing. But if I become that iteration and I lock myself into that, then what's happening? You know, how is that related to day-to-day life where I'm trying to be a good person? You know, how is that related to it? I'm saying people do want boxes. People do want belonging. We do want belonging. We do want to belong to something. We do want things that we could identify ourselves with. We do want to know a table is a table. You know, we do want to be able to touch these things, but we also want to be on the move as well. So I could say I'm a St. Lucian, but that doesn't mean I stay in St. Lucia. You know, I'm a St. Lucian, a proud St. Lucian. That doesn't mean that my evolution will not take me to Spain or will not take me to Russia, right? I could say I am male, but it doesn't mean that I don't have some female side inside of me that I need to be exploring, or it doesn't mean that in my day-to-day lives there are parts of me that don't manifest in a way that people might define as female. You know, so there's a difference between these apparent realities that are locked into definitions. The table remains that, it's hard, it's whatever, but we are not that. We're that and then some. We will be a table at some point in time, and tomorrow we might have need to be a chair. Context is important, and within African philosophy, within African spirituality, context is very important, even in terms of morality. So I'm saying we do want the boxes, and we do want also the moving, but we have to recognize that these are temporary. Don't we grow? You know, our skin is temporary, our teeth are temporary. For a while, these are our teeth, and we could identify with them, but after a while, we shed them and we move. And I think that is what's necessary. You know, the idea of not having to choose, so to speak. Yes, I'm African, but when I'm going to get a girlfriend or I'm going to do something like that, that's not necessarily the part of me that will be emphasized. So it cannot be my identity per se in the way that we think about it. You know, it's my identity with it because it's a part of me that becomes emphasized in a particular context, but not all contexts. So that's my answer. I think in terms of what Celia is saying, I don't know. I definitely think I don't know much about Kamal's experience. I know he's spoken about it as a historian, as a cultural theorist, and so on. But I actually don't know too much about Kamal's experience of colorism and racism in his own, except actually perhaps even through the very academy, which manifested more in a kind of rejection of the kind of African essence and spirit he was bringing to Caribbean literature at the time by some, persons who reacted negatively to it. In terms of Dereck, he writes about it. I think in many ways, I mean, there's the story of classism and stuff like that. I think in another life, in the story of him and the girl he was so in love with, I think there is the evocation of, I mean, within his own mother as well, his mother who was kind of mixed with Dutch or something like that. So there are some of these things there. So I don't know the extent. I can't say, because in fact with Walcott, I think a lot of it is coming out of his personal experience. I think in terms of his philosophy, it is what I think they call, is it a posteriori? I don't know if that's the word for it, but it's coming out of experience. In fact, he relies on experience to create his politics, more so than a kind of espousing of politics before the fact. So I would say a lot of what we're seeing is that. In terms of the etymology of the word Shabin, that's more of a personal conversation between Celia and I. She's a friend of mine. But in terms of that, the etymology of Shabin is one authoritative thing, but Walcott is claiming it in some sense. I mean, it could be a negative thing in the Caribbean, by and large. And in fact, I hear it more often used against women than it's often used for men. At least like hardly ever a man identifying with it, because the associations with it are so gendered. But I definitely think he's recognizing the pliability of anything, the pliability of meanings, the pliability, the way in which things could be bent and change. So his claiming of Shabin actually for me was very new, as somebody being able to claim that, let alone the person being a man, because I know it to be a term that is usually derogatory and used to kind of typify a particular type of woman or something like that. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. Got a few more questions that have come into the chat now. So Sylvia has posed a question, which is Pan-Africanism as a form of philosophical awareness. Assuming wanting your thoughts on that.
Okay.
Do you want to do that one first before we move on?
Yeah, I would agree with it. I mean, I think there's a way in which politics, which is not to say that is not important. I think, a lot of the problem in, I think, global Black struggle is not so much the content of what we espouse or what we take on. I think it's that we sometimes may not know how much emphasis to put on a particular thing, and where it needs to, it's the levels more so. It's a matter of degree, less so than a matter of what one is identifying with. We need to know to what degree is this useful. Not necessarily, oh, let's reject it and take this instead. To what degree is this useful? When W.E.B. Du Bois is talking about Black education within the US system, it's not that, oh, we need to either reject or accept this as something that's going to be productive. We need to understand, okay, what is this thing and to what degree is it useful to us? And let's remember that it's only useful to that degree, that there's something else that we need to a greater degree. So I often think it's a matter of degree. And I think that sometimes in terms of how the politics manifest, they could be very rigid, and they tend to manifest in polarities often. You're with it or you're not. You're kind of in it or you're not. You're either left or you're right, and so on. And I think there needs to be a revision of that. And I like this sense, the diffuse sense of a philosophical awareness, which allows people to interact with it in its own. And again, I'm not saying choose this philosophical awareness instead of the politics. The either or stuff needs to stop. And I think that's what Dereck represents. It's like, okay, how much emphasis do we place on this? And what should we expect from this reasonably? And how much emphasis do we place on that? And how much energy should we put into that based on how much we believe it's able to give? That's kind of how I see it.
Thank you. Got a question from Angela. Do you want to come off mute, please?
Sure. Hi. Thank you so much for such an interesting lecture and chapter. I had two reactions and questions, and I'm not entirely familiar. I'm actually very ignorant about Black liberation theology. But your comment about spiritualism and the analysis about Walcott and spiritualism and spirituality made me really think through that. I mean, I thought through what you said, and in my mind, there's quite a lot of spirituality in Black power movements, in Black liberation movements. And so I'm just curious if you could comment on that, if I've got that wrong, or how you would relate that impression to what you've said and written about Walcott. And then the other question is more, because I'm not familiar with the sort of circles around poetry, but if you could say anything, do you know if Dereck Walcott had any views about Maya Angelou as a poet? And she's in the Pantheon book, and she was an activist, and very much, I think she's in the book as an activist. So I would really like to hear if there's any kind of views that he had about her work and her place in the world.
Okay. I don't know of any comment, maybe somebody could correct me, but I don't know of Walcott having any comment on Maya Angelou. I mean, Walcott could be sometimes ungenerous in terms of like some other forms of poetic expression. I mean, there's a very famous clip of him mocking Kamau Brathwaite's poem Negus and its poetics, you know. But I also think in the same vein, and I think, you see, that's why the either or is never good. Walcott was a great admirer of one of our local, what you'd call folk musicians, you know, and that's not something a lot of people would know. But John Robert Lee, who's also here, would remember just a few years ago, he brought all of us to his house. We gathered at his house, and what he was working on was the translation of this very short song by this folk singer. He was trying to translate it into English because he was so struck by it. And he really had a lot of respect for the folk musicians. I hate the term folk, but the musicians that produce this kind of distinct cultural expression within St. Lucia and outside of St. Lucia in Trinidad, where he lived as well. He wrote for years about Calypso, right? So maybe he might not have taken to a particular, you know, writer, or maybe even the American factor may have kind of created something where he couldn't identify with that. I don't know, but there's no comment that I know of him on Maya Angelou, sorry, and but it's not to create a generalized view of him rejecting poets of a particular that take a particular approach. In respect to what you said about Black movement, yes, they're there, but you see, life is a text. Everything is a text, and the question is, what gets read? You know, how did we read Martin Luther King primarily? You know, what remains after? I remember at the conference, Lee Daniels made a very great presentation about another aspect of Malcolm X that we hardly see. It's in the book. You know, there are these people who exist as complex beings and they bring us something. And then there's the kind of community around them of interpretation. And sometimes based on what is dominant in that kind of community, it sometimes, many times, determines what their legacy will be. And I think that a lot of the time, there's still a great focus on a kind of secular politics as something that will actually lead to real change, real palpable, tangible change, etc. So I agree, and I agree that, in fact, I'm reading spirituality everywhere, you know, in some of the novels that don't seem to be about that. I'm seeing it, you know, but it's a matter of like, what, you know, we think about ideologies determining the productions of literature and so on, but it also produces a certain kind of reading. So it means that if many of us are like many people are writing particular kind of books now, let's say, because even that is a reduction, these ideological or intellectual movements, or even the way the academy works, makes us read things in a particular way that could help us to miss things. Last thing I'd say on that is, I remember reading an American psychologist who had to self-publish her work. And she was talking about the way a lot of African reading happens through the reading of signs and symbols, not actual signs and symbols, But even drawing from that alphabetized literature and writing, the signs that are there, even beyond just a symbol in the sense of a metaphor or whatever. So I do think there's a question of, you are right about the spirituality existing everywhere, because spirituality is not restricted to a particular area of life. But the question is, are we adequately equipped to read from an African type spiritual position, let's say, the poetics of African spirituality? It's more a matter of how equipped more people are in that regard and how they're likely to read things. Yeah, that's what I would say on that.
Thank you so much. We have another question here, which says, what can you say is the lasting legacy of Walcott for both the Caribbean and Africa?
You know, one of the lasting things is what Earl Lovelace said. Gordon Roller, who's an eminent Caribbean literary critic and so on, one of the things a lot of people know, or they seem to know of that generation about Walcott, is many times he became the very thing he critiqued. He would critique something at one point in time and later do it. He critiqued Carnival at some point in time, and later on he went into Carnival and was going to do, you know, I don't remember what exact role he was playing, but I think it was an utter failure, if I'm not correct. I wasn't alive at that time, but I've heard the stories. But he was willing to do that, and he was willing to do it. He obviously always had a stage, you know, his eyes were on him. He was not afraid of contradiction. And in fact, he recognized contradiction as an everyday quotidian thing, a necessary part of growth, a necessary part of evolution, and not a disqualifier as it tends to be within Western systems. The idea of contradiction, seeming contradiction, is a natural part of reality, that ultimately, if you're growing, you're going to disagree with your old self, you know? You're going to seem a hypocrite because yesterday you said, oh, this is not so, but you've grown, and today you're saying, oh, this is so. And then somebody will want to point out, but oh, you said yesterday that it was not so. That's growth, that's not necessarily contradiction, you know what I mean? So one of the things he represents is that bravery to kind of be wrong, to contradict self, because he always went back and forth. And, you know, that was evidence of him as a searcher, as somebody who was willing to continuously search himself. Even though he was always intense and impassioned in his arguments, he continued always to question himself. I'll give you a very brief story. I once wrote a very, very scathing review of one of Walcott's last plays, right? Maybe in my young, kind of arrogant way. And also I disagreed with him about a lot of things. And I didn't really like the play. And I remember writing that thing. And I met his wife at the airport. And I was like, hi. And she wasn't facing me. And she turned around and she was like, oh, Vladimir, the theater critic. And she walks off. And I thought, oh, Dereck Walcott is upset with me. This can't be good. Because if his wife is saying that. And we hadn't really been in contact before that. However, after that, he was inviting me to his house for the session we had. We started to interact with, we were never close, but I got to interact with him in a way that I never got to before after the writing of that bad review. So I think the point is he was always willing to kind of accept. I don't know that he agreed that I was right about his play, but maybe it's a sign that he kind of still respected the fact that it sent him to look again at what he did. I don't know. That might even be an arrogant assertion, but I'm saying is I think it's still an evidence. It's a moment that I read in a certain way that I see in his history of being able to accept contradiction, even when he seems like he doesn't on the surface. And he recognized that as part of growth. And that allowed him to do a lot, to cover a lot of ground, as Earl Lovelace said, to be everything in a way. That I think is his lasting legacy, our ability and our bravery individually to be contradictory, not just contradicting others, but to contradict ourselves as well.
Okay, thank you. Got a question from John. I can find it. Okay. Does his dream on Monkey Mountain set out, perhaps more than anywhere else in his poetry and plays, his ideas of Africa in the Caribbean?
Yeah, I think Dream on Monkey Mountain is probably the supreme statement on that. I'd rather tell people to read it. I haven't read it in a long time, so I don't want to venture it, but I do recognize it as his big statement on that. In fact, Dream on Monkey Mountain, I think, was accompanied, Robert, you could tell me if I'm wrong, in one of his publications, it was accompanied by that essay, The Muse of History. So it was like I think it was called The Muse of History and Overture, and he had the Dream on Monkey Mountain within that same publication. So there's a question raised therefore about the relationship of these texts to each other. And that Dream on Monkey Mountain was written at the height of that kind of Black Power moment. So it was kind of like his response to that as well. Yeah, that's I think it's definitely the play that was his. In fact, if you want the other version of The Muse of History as a response to it, that play, Dream on Monkey Mountain, is his response to Black Power. Through, he has Another Life, In Another Life, he has that, and he has What the Twilight Says. Oh yeah, no, I'm wrong. Sorry. But anyway, it's written at the same time. The Muse of History, Dream on Monkey Mountain, and Another Life, they're all, well, parts of Another Life, they all have moments of responding to that moment. So I think it's good.
Okay, thank you. There was a question here. Okay, question from Eric. Is there a tension between anachronistic creative Homer in London and the inventor whose invention is rooted in a specific context and time?
Could you repeat that, please?
Yes, is there a tension between anachronistic creative Homer in London and the inventor whose invention is rooted in a specific context and time? Oh,
okay. I hope I understand it correctly, but I definitely, in terms of, if you're referring to Walcott's stage meeting with Homer in Omeros that I drew attention to, Walcott saw the Caribbean archipelago as, in that same mythic structure, as another version of the Aegean, right? That archipelago, that Greek archipelago, that out of which would have come that Greek literature that Homer would have been engaged in. So there was not the sense of to be anachronistic is within a chronological history, and I don't think that's what he's espousing. So there would not be definitely the separation between the kind of current inventor situated in a particular place. In fact, he recognized Greek literature, while he recognized it as the classics, I think he also recognized it as a very provincial literature, not in the insulting sense of provincial, but something that's very much based in and of a particular place and carrying the sensibility of that place. So I think he sees a kind of equivalence between the Caribbean archipelago and his role and that of Homer, and that they are coextensive, because as you know of Omeros is his own rewriting of the Iliad. Ironically, a book he never finished reading. So maybe that itself speaks of that coextensive relationship between himself and the past, the so-called classics, and him and his, what he called his unimportantly beautiful island. So I hope that answers the question somehow. I wasn't sure if I got it correctly, so yeah.
Thank you very much. And then I think probably maybe finish on this one before I have a question of my own. This is from Noah, so it's quite long, but I'll hurry through it. So Vladimir, your allusion to evolution is interesting and problematizes the Pan-African agenda. Teilhard de Chardin, a great French theorist of evolution, predicted globalization, sensing that modernity had ushered mankind into the socialization of compression, meaning inescapable mixing of races, cultures, etc., thanks to telecommunications. Thus, I think the point now should be to create for Africans to produce grand narratives that address global challenges instead of African identity politics. Why can't we produce something coextensive to capitalism and Marxism, something that leads us to a post-capitalist, post-secular society and state?
Okay.
Thoughts?
I don't know. There's a lot about the perspective that seems to me to be very culturally specific. I would love to think that there is that whatever the Pan-African agenda is, that it's something that's always evolving. Any healthy thing does. So I kind of tend to like move away from either or very much, a rejection of and whatever, and in fact, if we think of African, at least some of the ways in which some people have revealed something about the African sensibility to us, the African sensibility. But anyway, what we have done is the ability to take something that's there and make it something more, or make it work for us. So that's one of the reasons why I'm not a fan of any kind of either or rejection. For one, there's the idea of Pan-Africanism is there. What use can it be? How much emphasis should we place on this aspect versus that aspect, et cetera, et cetera. So I do think there's always hope, you know what I mean, for anything. So if there is a very rigid, reified agenda, I don't know. But if it's there, the first question is, what do we do with it? Because it did come about for a reason, and very intelligent people were there. They were West Indians too. So, I mean, you had a lot of West Indians were some of those who were the chief architects of that, and they were very smart people. So my question is always to start with, what can we do with what's there? Even though it means changing it radically, what can we do with it? And the other part of it is, where did these systems come about? Capitalism, Marxism. These are not just economic systems, these are cultural expressions. These stem from a particular way of seeing the world, right? For one, there is a very strong sense in Marx, and I don't want to go deep down into Marxist whatever, but there's a very strong sense in Marx of man as a socioeconomic animal. Very few of these philosophies speak to what man as a spiritual being. And I don't want to go into that in any mystical sense. It is less about survival, and it's less about that kind of, I had to ask some students of mine, what is success? It's a word we use very often, but very often the same thing comes to mind for us. It's the attainment of things. It's our ability to have things. It's our ability to have things. Now, that is a very cultural perspective. That's a group of people for whom the possession of things equals a certain kind of high identity, right? Now, I don't know that that is necessarily how we see things, the possession of things. Is the earth to us, for example, land, or is the earth to us something other than land, other than something that could be owned, that could be divided, et cetera, et cetera? Is the earth for us the means of production, or whatever it is Marx calls it? The point I'm making is, from another philosophical perspective, all of this changes. So I'm not sure that our point of departure being these things gets us anywhere outside of these things. You understand? You're still within that kind of cultural emanation of its particular needs. I think the biggest trap of the world is that we're presented with things that present themselves as opposites, but what they are the polar opposites, the polar tendencies within one cultural emanation. Meaning, even though they're different and they seem opposed, and they maybe are opposed to some extent, they're still coming from a particular view of the world, two perspectives on a same view of the world. And the question we have to ask ourselves is, one, as Africans, is that deep down the vision of the world that we have or that we cherish? And even more important than that, is that the vision of the world that we want? So I think in terms of producing something, I welcome everybody to have their own opinion on it. For me personally, I am not into something coextensive with capitalism and Marxism, unless it is that we're going to take what this is and get to something very key within it that we could switch around to suit our needs. Because we have spiritual needs as human beings, which has nothing to do with church. It has to do with being happy. And I don't know that happiness resides in the accumulation of access to things. Part of it, yes, definitely. But only part of it. Only part of it. So, and equally, if you, at least my conception of time and what Walcott gave to us, there is no post anything. because this is a cultural emanation, remember capitalism as it manifests in now, neoliberalism, is what colonialism became for it to survive. So it means that there's a certain kind of determination and persistence in that cultural emanation, in that survival mode. So it's going to continue to shape itself into different things through the time, so it could continue doing the things that benefit those it was meant to serve. So too will Marxism and left-leaning politics change and modify to continue being themselves. The question is, what are we going to continue to put forward that are going to serve our spiritual needs, which don't only reside in the accumulation of things? And it may not take the form of a nation. It may not take the form of an empire. It might not take these kinds of obvious forms of wholeness. Pan-Africanism itself is a dispersed kind of association. There's no nation to which where we could go into, but that is a formation nonetheless. And that is a whole in a way while being something else. So I'll just end by saying something Walcott said and something Kamau said. Break a vase, and the love that reassembles the fragments is greater than that love that took its symmetry for granted. The fact is that these pieces are related. And as Kamau said, the unity is submarine. The unity is submarine. It need not congeal into a nation, or it need not congeal into a continent or something like that. It could be something where we are living in the world as African people through some movement of whatever shape or form that is informing what our true needs are, and more of our people are happy. I don't know what the shape of that is. I'm not a politician, but that more and more of our people are happy living wherever they're living in the world. That's my take on it.
Okay, wow. So much to take away from your presentation, from the Q&A, which has been brilliant. Thank you to everyone for your great questions. And thank you to you, Vladimir, for your time and for the knowledge. It really has been fantastic. Sadly, it's time to bring the evening to a close. I can't quite let you go without first asking you about your name. Since we're talking about definitions and
speaking of left wing,
you know. So Vladimir, how'd that come about?
you know, I think the story of my name is a very beautiful story, because I would tell people that I knew my father at some point in time would have identified as a Marxist, very early and short phase in his life, but he would have identified as that. So I always thought he gave me the name. And when I, inquired about it, I found out that it was my mother who gave me the name because she liked it. There's nothing more Caribbean than that. She's not into any of this politics stuff. She heard a name, she liked it, and so she gave it to me. Not caring about the ironies or contradictions that may be, I experience them day to day. Everybody's surprised to meet a Black man named Vladimir Lucien. That's good. I'm ambiguous in that sense.
Absolutely perfect.
Yeah.